Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Edinburgh International Conference Centre. My name is Marshall Dallas, and I'm Chief Executive of this amazing business here. And I'm delighted to welcome you all here tonight to EICC Live, our series of free public talks which are designed to enhance our commitment to community engagement, to bring people together, to educate, and of course to inspire. Since its launch in 2019, we've hosted talks on a wide range of areas, including the future of healthcare, the Hyperloop, sport endurance, banking and neurodiversity, to name but a few. Now, these lectures and talks speak to our vision, which is to create an environment which inspires ideas that change the world. So tonight, I'm particularly pleased that this event is in partnership with the David Hume Institute. They believe in the power of diversity of thought and in the value of bringing people together in an atmosphere of respectful debate. So listening to their voices from across society, I believe their aims and values speak perfectly to ours. Ideas that change the world are often curated through curious, inclusive, rigorous, independent, and open discourse. And I would encourage you, as we listen to Baroness Ashton, to consider which ideas inspire you. Do they speak of collaboration? Do they inspire you to grow your own diplomatic endeavours? Can you apply these ideas to your environment and, who knows, maybe change your world or the world? But before handing over to the floor to our speakers, a little housekeeping. There are no planned fire alarms this evening, so if an alarm does sound, please follow the signs and exit the building as quickly and safely as possible. For those of you on social media and who would like to amplify the conversation, I would encourage you all to share your thoughts and post using the hashtag EICC Live. So let's get started. I'd like to welcome to the stage our host for this evening, the journalist, an events host, podcaster and communications consultant. Please give a warm welcome to Claire English.
Thank you, Marshall. Thanks very much. I almost didn't recognize myself there. Hello, it's lovely to be back here and really dive into what we hope is going to be a really candid account of a career that most of us, some of you will, but most of us will know very little about. To echo Marshall's words, we need more of these public conversations and events. They're eye-openers, they're eyebrow raisers, they're provocative, they're entertaining, and it's just what the doctor ordered in these very straight and difficult times. And they remind us that the world is complicated, but, you know, as we're seeing tonight, there are many people who are still on the side of the angels, the peacemakers. Not many of us, though, will be privy to the high-level negotiations that take place during trade talks, humanitarian crises, or conflict resolution. Our esteemed guest tonight is going to lift the lid on that for us. She's supremely qualified to do so. Her career has been long and varied, but she's written all about it in her book and experience as a top EU diplomat. And the book is called And Then What? You'll see some of the merch. It's not the merch. You're going to kill me for that, actually. The merch down there, but the book is fabulous. I tell you, it's a glorious ride. So many incidents, so many characters, and so much fortitude needed to keep going and believe that resolution can be found in a room where it looks unlikely in the vast majority of cases. So we're not going to hang about. We need to hear from someone who's navigated this very strange world. She's taken her share of flack, especially in the early days when she was a virtual unknown. But many have praised her amazing skills. They've said she's a consensus builder, a persuader, a charmer, not a great big bruiser, excellent at building good relations with people, and a good negotiator. That's what we need. We are, of course, talking about Baroness Catherine Ashton. Please give her a big Edinburgh International Conference Centre whoop or hello. It's lovely to have you here. And I was having the debate about whether I'm calling you Baroness, Lady, Catherine. What are you going for?
Cathy.
Fine. Is there a reason for this?
Well, I think the Baroness and other stuff gets in the way, really, of having a conversation. And it's just me, you know.
Just Cathy?
It's just me.
Okay. Family not slag you off for being a Baroness, or they couldn't understand what it was?
No, when I first became a Baroness, my daughter Rebecca was 7. And she went to school on the morning it was kind of announced. And her teacher said to her, "Now, Rebecca, something's happened to Mummy. Do you know what it is?" And Rebecca, being my daughter at age 7, said, "Of course, Mrs. Scruton," that's her teacher, "Mummy's become a Baroness." And her teacher said, "Yes, but Rebecca, do you know what that means?" I said, "Oh, yes. She's halfway between an MP and a princess."
And that's how we're going to remember you.
For her, far too much like the MP and not enough the princess.
I should say, you're all going to get your chance to ask Cathy some questions later on, so please line them up in your head and make some mental notes as well. It's going to be a very fascinating journey, I am sure. Oh, you've got a lot of firsts under your belt for a starter. First female Chancellor of the University of Warwick, is that right?
Yeah.
HRVP, we'll explain that later, in Europe. First from your family to attend uni. I'm sure there are a lot of other firsts in there. So, not surprisingly, you end up doing a job that you never engineered. Are you the accidental diplomat?
Completely accidental. You know, the way that some jobs are created and the way that they turn out is often a compromise. And compromise gets a bad press. Because actually, when you're trying to find agreements or ways forward, we all compromise all the time. And it's a word that I would like to kind of put back in the dictionary in a positive way, rather than it being saying, "Oh, this person was a compromise candidate." Well, that means everybody agreed, which is much better than being somebody that people don't want. So I was a compromise, and I put it sort of in a simple way that when they were creating these new roles in Europe, one of the things was that they wanted the British to have one of the jobs. This was in the time of the Gordon Brown government, so it was that sort of flavour of politics. So British. They really needed a woman in one of the top jobs across Europe, including NATO, which was sort of not part of the package, but nonetheless considered one of the big jobs, of course. The presidents of the Council and the Commission, presidents of the Parliament, all men. So they said, well, we need our sort of foreign minister, our high representative, to be a woman. And in the way that politics plays its part, in the outcome of the elections across Europe, the Conservatives as a group had been the biggest winner, so they'd taken the 2 presidency roles, and that left the kind of left of centre, the Social Democrats, Socialists, whatever you want to call them, needing a place. So you had British woman, sort of left of centre government. And as the president of the commission said to me, who they heard of in Berlin? Because I was then trade commissioner, the first woman trade commissioner. And so there is always an accident in this, but in the best form of compromise, I became the candidate that the leaders, the heads of state and government and the commission could all agree to unanimously. And that's how you end up in those positions. It doesn't always go down well with the press. It especially didn't go down well with the British press, who said lots of pretty unkind things, or a lot of, well, who is she? Where does she come from? But hopefully that kind of turned around by the end.
I think it did. Diplomacy is a big word. It means different things to different people depending on their worldview, their politics, even their geography. So for you, Cathy, what is a diplomat? What is diplomacy?
It's a good question. I mean, you've got the kind of Ferrero Rocher type picture in your mind, for those of you who remember the adverts about that. And you also have a kind of image of people emerging from days and weeks of negotiations with their sort of sleeves rolled up or looking dishevelled because they've not slept. And in a way, both are good representations of diplomacy, because it is about the relationships that you're trying to deal with or to establish or to grow and develop, on behalf of your country or your organisation with others. And it is also the job of good diplomats to manage problems and crises as they arrive, often seemingly, in my experience, out of nowhere. That these are things that you look back on and you can see coming the time you don't. So it's a sort of spectrum of activity. But diplomats are people who work for you. They are the people who try and make the lives of people who live in a country better. They try and make it easier to travel, easier to trade, easier to feel safe and secure, easier to feel that there are agreements that are going to benefit you. So diplomacy for me is also incredibly domestic, even though we don't think about it in that way.
You've also said it's underrated and undervalued. There's a frustration there.
Definitely, because we invest a huge amount, and understandably so, in defence and security issues. I would argue that diplomacy is part of that. When you're trying to develop relationships with other countries, having a stronger, bigger team of diplomats or a more capable team or people who are looking at different aspects of diplomacy, economic diplomacy is one, or what we've been doing on climate change, there's a lot of diplomacy in that and so on. We don't seem to put the same emphasis on improving the abilities of diplomats. We have some great diplomats in this country, we have some great ones in Europe, but they would be the first to say there are things they don't know, things they would like to know, training they could be given, expertise they could call upon, and also expanding the range of what they can do. So when we're thinking about how do we tackle some of the big questions that face us, for example, very current now, is what on earth we're going to do about the relationship, in quotes, with China. What we don't talk about is actually, do we need to also think about how to use our diplomats more effectively? These are not people that do the soft stuff. These are the people that do the hard-edged, hard-nosed things that will make a difference. These are the people that go into the room and argue about questions of human rights, about what's happening in a particular place or on a particular issue. So they are not people that you should think of as being too much of the Ferrero Rocher. Think more of the coming out of the room having spent 3 weeks trying to solve a problem.
Yes, and that is quite interesting because the book's title that you've got here, and then what kind of sums up what you've basically got to achieve. Because, well, we were talking before you all came in here, and your job is to basically get agreement. But that phrase, tell us about that, why that's the title.
It's something I used to say a lot. When you're thinking about a problem, a crisis has happened, it's, we're watching Tahrir Square and suddenly Egypt is in flames and we don't really know exactly what we're looking at. We're trying to think what to do. You can't afford just to think, what do we do now? But then what? What's the answer beyond it? And too often in our thinking about crises, think about what's happening for those of you watching, how Haiti has completely collapsed, or of course the ongoing war in Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East, especially we think about Gaza, but we mustn't forget the horrors that were inflicted on Israel. Thinking about all of these different questions, it's not enough to say, well, let's have a 6-month plan in place. Too often it's a bit like that game you used to play as a kid, whack-a-mole, knock down the problem, it's gone away for the minute and move on to the next problem. For me, it's much more about how do we think long-term? How do we think about the next stage? If a problem has taken 50 years to erupt, or sometimes, as in the case of Serbia and Kosovo, they would refer to the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. Or the drop of a hat, they would refer to it. So you have to think, well, if these things last this long, decades, centuries, why do we think we can resolve it in 5 minutes, 10 weeks, 6 months, 10 years? Why is it enough for 1 generation of girls to go to school and we think that's done? No, it's 5 generations, it's 10 generations. It's when it becomes normal and part of the fabric of that community. So for me, it was always, yeah, we can do this, we can solve this problem, and then what? What do we do next?
Let's reel back. I want to find out about you growing up, what kind of aspirations you and your family had in mind for you when you were young, what life was like. So you're a Lancashire lass.
Yeah.
Tell us more.
Yeah, I still say grass and
Not
bath. Makes my family laugh, but that's what I do. I grew up in Upholland, which is a tiny village near Wigan, between Liverpool and Manchester, to position it. And my family DNA goes back to the same group of villages for at least 350 years. So I'm the most boring person you will ever meet. My family always aspired that I would get the opportunity to go to university, because that was not something that had ever been part of either my mother or my father's family. They became reasonably well off, but my father's family especially were very poor. And so, you know, he'd done a degree at night school and he was the first to do that. So the next thing was university. My brother and I were fortunate enough to do that. And so aspirationally, I think for me it was about all the things that I was interested in and wanting the chance to try out different things. I am a generalist in the sense that I'm not an expert on anything. I'm not clever in a particular way. I'm not a lawyer or a teacher or a doctor or anything like that. But what I'm pretty good at is using the skill set I've got and applying it to different things. And I often say to students and to young diplomats, just work out what kind of person you are will help you work out what kind of roles you can play. Because some people become absolute experts on a particular part of the world in diplomacy. Others become more of an expert in how you do things. So for me, it was about trying to apply those skills. And I went to London University and sort of stayed in that part of the world where there were more opportunities for the kind of things I wanted to do.
Remind us what you studied. Was it social science?
I did sort of, it's an economics degree, but it was social sciences and bits of law and all sorts of bits and pieces.
But at that point, had it even crept into your mind that you would end up being a diplomat?
No. And partly because, and again, I say this to students at graduation at Warwick, where I've been for a few years, I'm about to finish my time as Chancellor, is that the things that may give you most satisfaction or demand most from you in life in terms of a job may not exist yet. You know, Apple meant something completely different to me as a child and to most of you. That there were things that simply weren't there. The technological changes have been vast, but so too have changes in the way we look at history, geography, geology, how we deal with different scientific achievements and so on. The opportunities are very different. So the job that I ended up, in a sense, or where I ended up needing to put more of me into it and do most, nobody had ever thought of until only a few months before I took it on.
Well, let's jump right to that and to the beginning of the book. And can I say, the book wouldn't have come about had it not been for Peter, your husband, sort of nagging you to tell him more about what your week had been. Can you explain that, first of all, how this book even assembled itself?
So he said to me when I got the job, you will never keep a diary, which I never have done. But he said, you might be interested to look back on some of this stuff in the future. So he calls himself a recovering journalist. He set up that when I was home, that he would just put a tape recorder on the table and get me to talk, not so much about the kind of what I call the lines that do the picture, but colouring in the picture. What did it feel like? What were they wearing? How did they look? What happened, you know, in what they said? And over the period of the 5 years, we did 39 stories, in fact. Some of them linked together because we did quite a lot on Iran and quite a lot on Serbia and Kosovo. And he never said anything about the tape. And at the end of the 5 years, he handed me the tape. You all remember tapes, don't you?
Yeah, just.
And said, over to you. And I put it in a drawer for 2 years. And then I was curious. And of course, what's fascinating is not only what you talk about, a lot of the detail you've forgotten, but also how your voice expresses how angry you are about something or fed up with them, or how you believe you'll never get to the end of this issue or whatever. And so I took, for the book, 7 stories and told those because I thought they illustrated different elements of diplomacy. And also they had an arc to the story. You know, there's lots of things. I did a huge amount in the Middle East, which I don't talk about in the book, but I do talk about Libya and Egypt, and tried to sort of tell a story of come with me. Just come on this plane or come into this room. It's only me. But, you know, you'll see the moment when I absolutely have to have a glass of white wine. I'm sorry, but I just do. Or the moments when you realise you've not eaten for quite a long time. Or the funny parts of what happens, because it's a bunch of human beings in a room or in a place or in the middle of a demonstration or in Medan in the freezing cold, trying to work out what to do to solve a problem or to make things better.
Right at the beginning of the book, you get a surprise because, well, it's a bit of a farce really, isn't it, how you find out about your first big job. It involves Gordon Brown. It's 2007. Do you want to take it up from there?
2008, I think.
2008, sorry, beg your pardon.
That's right.
That's all right.
So in 2008, I was leader of the House of Lords. And it was the end of October. The House was about to go back. It's a Friday morning. I've arranged lunch with my opposite number, Lord Strathclyde, who, because he and I are going to work out some level of agreement about what we're going to do in terms of bringing our people in on 3-land whips, because keeping people late at night, night after night, is a challenge. He's going to surprise me, I know, nonetheless, to try and defeat me, because I'm at that point the government, he's the opposition. But we want to make sure that we're not being unreasonable to people. So we have lunch booked. And I've gone off to the gym, and my phone keeps ringing from a journalist. I say in the book I think just a journalist. It's actually Nick Robinson from the BBC.
I was just going to ask you who it was.
Yeah. And Nick, who I do know, and I couldn't for the life of me work out why Nick kept trying to get hold of me, because Leader of the House of Lords is not a job that demands a lot of media attention. So I left the gym and went home because I thought, well, I'll speak to him there. At which point my husband opened the door and said, "Have you seen this?" And on the TV, on the BBC and on Sky, on the ticker tape bit of the news, it says Cathy Ashton is going to Brussels to replace Peter Mandelson as Trade Commissioner. And I thought, okay. And Peter said, "Has anyone rung you?" "No, of course not. No. So is it true?" "Well, I don't know." But the BBC and Sky appear to have the story, at which point our phones are just ringing all the time. But we can't do anything because, of course, until you're appointed officially by the Prime Minister, it doesn't exist. And this went on for some hours. My driver turned up. The drivers always know everything. No, not a clue. Didn't know what was going on. And so we giggled our way back into London, me ignoring all the messages and kind of queries coming in. And I went to meet Lord Strathclyde for lunch. And he had a bottle of champagne waiting, and congratulations. And I said, "Well, it would be, but actually nobody's rung me yet." And he roared with laughter because he said, "Yeah, we were the same in government. It's just, you know." And then about an hour later, the Prime Minister did ring. And to be fair to him, he just assumed somehow that there was a slightly separate process that had gone on, to which I'd pointed out, there isn't, it has to be you. And he said, "Okay, can you get the next train to Brussels?" And I said, "Well, my passport is not with me." And he said, "But you've got to go tonight because we've got to make sure we keep the trade portfolio." So Peter had to pack a bag, get my passport, get on a train, because I lived just outside London at that point, and come and find me, and then get me a seat on an overcrowded Eurostar, which fortunately he managed to do because he happened to know somebody in Eurostar. I'd been abandoned by the government at this point because, of course, I was no longer of them. And I got on the train. and went to Brussels. Little did I know it would be 6 years before I came back.
Amazing. And it's a good job if you like travel and complex discussions, you say in the book. Lucky for you then.
Yeah, I like travel. I don't have jet lag. So
you can pack a mean bag for 3 weeks, apparently. Yeah, tiny bag.
Tiny bag. I travel on hand luggage only, no matter how long the journey. Yeah, I mean, it was extraordinary. But of course, it was a logistical nightmare to begin with, because my home and my family were in a different country. It was a year originally for the end of the trade mandate, so you can't do much to sort of move things around. And you're also constantly on a plane, even as Trade Commissioner, and it became worse as High Representative. So you sort of have to rework overnight your entire life, which was a bit of a challenge.
Bit of a challenge just arriving there as a complete greenhorn, not knowing how anything worked, and suddenly you're expected to take on this amazing portfolio that Peter Mandelson's had. How did it feel? Do you remember it feeling overwhelmed, or are you just kind of champing at the bit to get started?
I arrived on the train and found our EU ambassador at that time, Kim Darroch, who you may know from being the ambassador to the US who had to get out because his telegrams had been released, and the then President Trump was not impressed with what he had said about it. And so I knew him, and I was very fortunate that by then and later Chief of Staff was a person I'd worked with in London already, who comes from Manchester, so has the same sense of humour and also says grass. And his family, who became extremely close, and without him I'd probably not survived. But so there were people around. But no, you are. It's an alien world with bits of familiarity, is how I'd put it.
But for any deal makers in the room, it's intriguing to find out how you even go about brokering a trade deal with 28 nations all wanting different things. That's not your remit. That wasn't your remit. How do you learn that stuff? What do you do? It's
an A level a day, is how I would put it, or Scottish hire.
Yeah. Oh, you're good.
That you find yourself just having to cram as much information. I mean, there are some incredibly competent, able, talented people around you. So, they're not letting you loose on trade deals without serious people who know what they're doing. They just want you to understand enough that you can clinch the deal at the end. I mean, you're doing the kind of final bits of negotiation, which in many negotiations are about the bits of trust that you have to build in, that let people know that you've not, that what you're trying to do is end up with something that's not just good enough, but extremely good, and that they can sell as well as you can sell. So I completed the deal with South Korea. I opened the Canada trade deal, and I did a lot of work with the US. We solved a lot of problems that had been decades old with the US, that just, in a way, just needed a bit more push and a bit of compromise and a bit of understanding of what we all wanted to do. And we managed to find ways to achieve that in actually quite a short period of time. So you have to learn non-tariff barriers and phytosanitary and all this kind of language. But that's really about understanding the kind of enough of the detail. Just as when I came on to do the Iran negotiations, I could probably have got an A level in nuclear physics or a bit more, because I had to understand, heavy water reactors and what centrifuges did and what IR2s and IR1s and IR6s did, which are the type of centrifuges that...
Blimey, you can still remember.
Remember bits of it very well. But at the time, you had to know enough that when you were doing a negotiation, you couldn't be fooled by somebody, you couldn't accidentally agree to something, and you knew how to put things together, because deals are jigsaw puzzles. And you have to, in the end up with a picture that when you look at it, you know what it is. It doesn't matter so much the size and shape of the pieces, as long as the picture is complete and the pieces all fit together. So if you're negotiating about how big a stockpile could be versus how many centrifuges are spinning versus what you do on the conversion of a heavy water reactor to a light water reflector. It's a puzzle, because how you do that will determine whether you've achieved the objective of making sure that there's not going to be a nuclear weapons program in Iran.
It just sounds absolutely terrifying, the amount of expertise you've got to accrue and make sense of and then apply.
You've always got a team, you've always got...
What, are they passing you bits of paper? What are they doing?
Sometimes you're on your own as well. You do a lot of negotiation at the end with the minister to minister, as it were. But you're not, you also learn that if you're not sure what it is, you say, I don't know what that is, so let's not stop. And you go outside and find the person and go, what's that? So you don't sort of pretend to be, you don't use bravado in it. You actually know what you know. Some people must do.
Do you not think there was quite a lot of bluster? And I won't say which gender, but...
I think there's always an element of, I think, there are two things. It's not so much bluster. There are two things that need to happen. One is about building enough trust in the room that people can try out ideas they don't have a mandate for. And that's really important, because when you start with positions, this can apply in business as much as it applies in diplomacy. When you've got positions, you kind of go in, this is my position, this is their position. The two don't fit together, there's no jigsaw puzzle. So you're going to have to find a way to make the pieces fit if you're going to get an agreement that both of you could sell and that gives you enough of what you need to feel that you've achieved your objective. It's not about giving in, it's not about doing less, it's about what do I actually need to achieve this negotiation. And in that, you will therefore, both of you, or however many parties, have to go off-piste, have to find things. Well, what if we did this? And there'll be things that are not within the mandate you've been given, but you need to find out. So you have to build enough trust that those things stay in the room and don't leave. And that sometimes feels like bluster. It's not bluster, it's about doing that. And then there are things where people have to make it clear that they are prepared to walk away or prepared to do the unthinkable. And if you remember in the case especially of the Iran negotiations, we didn't have a lot of other options. We had sanctions and then we had action of some kind or another. So there's also a sense that you are reminding yourself and others that the options available to you are limited, but you're not taking them off the table completely. Because that's about making it clear that this is serious. Even if that's not what you want to do at all, it has to be there as a possibility.
You met some amazing people. What a cast. But the one that caught my eye was the controversial and colourful Silvio Berlusconi. He had sex on the brain, didn't he? Because he did show you a photograph of a university campus, and then he tell them what the take was.
He was a very interesting character. And I had two audiences with him. And, he was a flamboyant character. The thing that was very interesting about him, and is interesting about all of these big players, is how, in a way, they make their country unforgettable, in a sense. People will talk about leaders, whether they're good or bad, in the context that they somehow put their country on the map. It's not necessarily the map you want them to put them on. And Berlusconi certainly made sure Italy was never forgotten in any discussions of any kind. I sort of see that as largely a positive, if not always. But he was somebody who thought and talked about relationships a lot. So I went to see him, and it was unusual because I was foreign minister level and he was, it was called president in Italy, but it's a prime ministerial role. But he wanted to talk about a particular trade issue. And he showed me photographs of a new university he was building and how he wanted to take two people from most major countries who were really smart and bring them to this new kind of university, obviously a girl and a boy. And then he showed me a picture of the grass, the long grass and the lawn. And he said, and you see, there'll be lots of places where they can go.
You're not expecting that, are you?
No, and you could see his staff kind of moving in on it. Because, you know, and he was saying it in a very fun way. And it was amusing in its own way. But you kind of, well, Mr. President, that's, you know, what do I say, as it were. So there were lots of kind of ways in which he would weave in things like that.
Well, it couldn't be more different to ask you now about Vladimir Putin, because he is not that person. Tell me when you first encountered him and what you made of him, because he seems so inscrutable. Is he that inscrutable person?
So Putin is somebody that I would describe it like this. If you were at a party, you know where the host or the hostess is or are because of the way people stand in a room. If you're in a room with celebrities, the most important celebrity, you'll always know where they are because you can tell by where people stand. Not necessarily that they stand close to them, but everybody's conscious of where that person is, and it means that the room, when you look at it, is a particular shape. And the thing about President Putin is you always know where he is in a room. Doesn't matter if it's full of world leaders, you always know where he is in a room, because everybody is conscious of him. I first met him when I was trade commissioner, and I went to the Kremlin with a group of commissioners to talk about economic issues with him. And I suppose that the two or three things that you just need to know about him. The first is that he is exactly as you think he is in terms of height, shape, whatever. Because some leaders are not. They're smaller or they're taller.
Are you going to name names?
Well, Tony Blair is taller than people think he is. Right? If you meet, he's not that much taller, but he is. Everybody always says, oh, he's a bit taller than I thought. It's just one of those things. Other leaders, actors are always the classic, aren't they? They're often smaller than you think they are. But he is the height and type of person that you would expect him to look like, and he does not have piercing blue eyes or shark eyes or anything like that. He has blue eyes, so don't get carried away with the supernatural stuff that people put around him. He's not. But he is driven by a combination of history and legacy. That he is the leader who is determined to restore the Russian status, not the Soviet Union, the Russian status as a kind of empire or as a serious superpower, not a regional power. And he is driven by his determination that will be his legacy, and that means he will not, in his own mind, lose Ukraine. He's lost Ukraine. He lost it a long time ago, and he certainly lost it when he invaded it. But in his mind, Ukraine cannot be lost because that does not fit with the historical perspective of Russia. And he's entirely transactional in his relationship with you. So if you are, as a country or a group of countries, a power bloc, whatever, useful to him and his vision for Russia, then he will meet with you, he will try and extract from you what will make a difference for him. He has very little interest in making a difference for you. He has very little interest in what the relationship might mean in terms of bringing together countries to work together, to be partners in something or whatever. It's transactional. So on the one hand, I dealt with him on the Ukraine crisis, way back at the beginning. And on the other hand, I was leading for on the Iran talks, chairing the Iran talks, and Russia was a partner. So on the one hand, my conversations with Russia were entirely negative on Ukraine, and on Iran, we were partners, and we would move between those two things. So I would fly from the Iran talks in Vienna, where the Russians were my partner, to Kyiv to give a press conference about the Russians' behavior and our attitude and our sanctioning of that behavior at a press conference in Kyiv, and then I would fly back.
What a strange relationship that is.
Yeah.
And to get it right in your head, where am I? Which mode am I in now?
Well, for some people, and I'd understand this completely, you'd think, well, how can you possibly, in the circumstances, and now it wouldn't be possible because of what's happened with Ukraine, but in the circumstances that already existed, they'd taken Crimea, there was chaos in the Donbass and so on, how could you? But one of the things that diplomats have to think about is the compartmentalization of issues. If you take climate change, the work that needs to go on to resolve climate change in the sense of making it not get worse requires us to talk to a lot of countries and a lot of people that we might not want to in any other circumstance. So you have to think about, can we do that in the context too of having very difficult and challenging relationships with that country at the same time? And I again cite China as I did at the beginning. Do we stop talking to them about climate change because we now have a huge problem of cybersecurity? What do we do about economic issues and so on? In other words, sometimes these relationships are multifaceted. So in the context of trying to get an agreement to stop Iran developing a nuclear weapon, which we did until it was changed by Donald Trump, it was important that the Russians were part of that because it was the Security Council. And that was worth preserving after all the years of working on it, even though obviously things were deteriorating and rapidly on the issue of Ukraine.
But knowing what we know now and seeing what's happening just now, Kathy, do you think somebody like Putin is somebody you can have a diplomatic or negotiation with?
I think it's pretty unlikely that that's going to happen now. I can't see how that would be an option. I think it's very difficult to imagine. But, you know, one of the things that you also learn in diplomacy is that you always have to be ready in circumstances that you can't foresee where a resolution that's positive can be found. It is for the people of Ukraine to decide what happens for Ukraine. It is for them to decide if they want to talk to anybody about anything, not for us. But diplomats need to stand ready to help. And there could come circumstances where they feel that there isn't something they want to talk about. Like they did with the grain shipments. That was a conversation that went on between them because it had to. So too, there may be, I don't know what and I don't know when, and I'm not suggesting that it will happen at all. But if it did, it is because in the world of diplomacy, you are by definition not talking to you are talking to your friends, but in negotiation, you're not talking to people you necessarily even want to be in the room with. You're talking to people with whom you need to find a way forward.
It's not all about conflict resolution or things like that. You had the natural disasters that you were hurled into when you got the big job, the High Representative, Vice President. So that's foreign affairs and security, the hugest deal. It's a massive portfolio, isn't it? And immediately you've got Somalian famine, pirates, Haiti, Japan. It's a crazy introduction to the job. Do you go about your work in a completely different way when it's a natural disaster?
Well, there's a sort of two sides to it, really. The first is, of course, the immediate response. You know, give people food, shelter, medical attention, find them, and try and offer as much support as you can at that immediate time. And the EU had an incredibly good crisis response team that were excellent at supporting all of the big agencies with funding, but also could put people on the ground really quickly. My job was to coordinate all the member states because in a crisis, what you don't want is everybody turning up with tents and nobody turning up with water. So you also have to literally coordinate what's going on. And then there are the things that have to come afterwards, which are how do you rebuild or deal with what's happened for the people on the ground for the long-term future. And it applies to a lot of things. It also applies, by the way, to the effects of climate change now. I can remember a conversation right at the beginning with the US, with a man called Richard Holbrooke, who some of you will remember, about floods in Pakistan, and villages that have been flooded for the third or fourth or fifth year running, who were going to be flooded every year from now on, and would have to move. And how do you tell people, how do you persuade people who've lived there generation on generation on generation that they're going to have to live somewhere else? So there are lots of crises that happen. And in earthquakes, I saw both the terrible disaster of Haiti in 2010, which in 30 seconds, 235,000 people died. 95% of Port-au-Prince, the capital, was destroyed. It's hard to find the other 5%. And how you take a country that is abject poverty with gang warfare, which we now know has pretty much taken over the country, traumatized people who are left behind. Aftershocks that, when I was there, were really concerning, and for many people meant they simply couldn't stay in what bit of their house they had left. Lots of things to be demolished, lots of things to be dealt with. You know, how do you not only put in the short term, but how do you think about how you're going to rebuild this country? And in Japan, which didn't need help, but the tsunami was an extraordinary event that we all watched on endless circuits on television, and the earthquake that preceded it. But I went to Japan 8 months after the earthquake, down to Matsushima, which was the center of it, and seeing that even Japan was still grappling with what you do about all of this debris, ships in the middle of fields miles from the coast, mangled bits of cars, flooded places where they had grown rice that were now completely destroyed because it was salt water, bits of islands that have disappeared, a new coastline, people's houses with their clothes still hanging in them. You know, in the closets you could see that had opened. It was an extraordinary experience to realize that the long-term nature of these things. So you're again trying to think, well, how do we help rebuild the economy? Not in Japan, because they can do that, but certainly in Haiti. But how do we also support the people in Japan who just needed lots of practical things, which the Japanese were pleased to have support for, and working out what you do. And it's back to the and then what moment. You know, what do we do in the much longer term? And of course, in Japan, it was about Fukushima, what was going to happen to that area, and the consequences when you realize that, you know, just as Chernobyl had been, that there are nuclear accidents that can happen or nearly happen that can be devastating.
I'm going to drag you back to conflict, but only because I want to go back to something else you mentioned, trust and human relations and how important that is. And I wanted to ask you about, well, you've mentioned Iran a few times, and I will get to that, but Kosovo and Serbia, you had two prime ministers in the room. They didn't look like they were going to reach any agreement. You did it, but you started off by doing something which was quite brave of you, and maybe you can explain what you asked them to be.
Well, if you can picture the scene, it's again a Friday afternoon, and I have persuaded two prime ministers who are the same age, who live a few miles away from each other, in reality, who've never met, to come into a room with a translator each and meet myself and one official, a wonderful Italian called Fernando Gentilini, who ought to really be the star of the show, and to sit and have a conversation. If you could see the look of fear and how much they are sweating and frightened, and my concern that one of them is going to do a runner, because they were being asked to come and sit down with the devil. For Serbia to sit with Kosovo was somehow to say that Kosovo had some legitimacy, which for the Serbian Prime Minister was not going to go down well in Belgrade. And for Kosovo to sit with the people who had, in their eyes, tortured and murdered them for generations was to sit with the worst perpetrators. And yet they did. And we had a 1-hour conversation. I didn't dare risk it going longer than that because, again, one of the things you learn about negotiations is choose your timing well. Don't allow it to disintegrate make sure that you've given them enough time to say the things they really have to say, but stop the conversation. But the thing that I asked them to be was brave, because it's very often easy for leaders, having climbed up into the leadership role, to sort of go, phew, done that, and not do anything to rock the boat. Leaders generally look for re-election. They want to do things to please people. They don't want to do things that are going to be very tough, and they don't want to do things that some people will never accept. They were being asked in both cases to do exactly that. They were being asked to make a massive change in both Kosovo and Serbia, both countries as far as I was concerned, in both places as far as Serbia would be concerned, and to start a process that we all knew, Fernando and I knew, would take them much closer to the EU and potentially one day would take them in. And it was obvious within half an hour that I'd found the right two people at that time to be able to do it. Now,
when do you know it's changing, that the temperature is changing and the whole vibe?
It's the way they speak. It's something about in a negotiation. You often know, and again, if you've done negotiation on anything, you know when people have kind of got hooked because they start talking about the detail. They've stopped talking about the principle. They're in the detail. Well, there's something about an initial conversation when they've sort of done their 5 minutes of, why you are wrong, and they start talking about things that matter to both of them. And they just started to talk to each other quite calmly as people. And so I invited them both to come back and have dinner. Because again, one of the ways that you deal in negotiation, in my view, is that you make things easier and calmer and you use food. In the Iran talks, I had dinner with the Iranians before every session. So every time we met, the night before, I and two of my colleagues would have dinner with the chief negotiator, both in the Ahmadinejad years and in the Rouhani years. And the reason was, if you have dinner with someone, I call it the warm-up, the night before, when you meet in the formal meeting the next day, the first thing you get to say is thank you for dinner. And it's quite hard to start a negative conversation after you've had thank you for dinner. And you also have worked out what mood they're in, what's going on. You've warmed it up. So never forget the warm-up. And dinner is a good way to get people who need to have difficult conversations to actually have a conversation. So we use food a lot with the Serbs and Kosovars.
Well, it worked, didn't it? Especially with Javad Zarif, who said, the Iranian foreign minister, he said he would only deal with Lady Ashton. That's quite a compliment. But I'm also noticing that you're very good at the micro details as well. The seating plan, John Kerry, that caused a bit of a kerfuffle, didn't it? You had to sort of move people around to get a picture. There was a picture that was wanted of him with the foreign minister, wasn't it? And everybody wanted that picture.
That's right. We've had lots of pictures are really important because they're worth, pictures, it's 1,000 words. It's more than that, really, because it says a lot. And in certain situations, how you sit and where you sit matters. So when the Iranian foreign minister, Javad Zarif, who'd been appointed by Rouhani, came to New York for the UN, it was important for the US to be able to show the Secretary of State sitting next to the Iranian foreign minister. And so we engineered it to make sure that it looked as, they weren't actually quite next to each other, but it looked like they were, because that was an important picture to paint. But there were plenty of pictures where you are judged by who you sit closer to. So in the first picture of Serbia and Kosovo, because in that prime ministerial meeting, we took one photograph, and I told them we would not release it until they both agreed. And they both agreed the next day, and the picture went round the world. But because it was on 3 sofas, and I'm sitting with my official, I was sitting closer to one prime minister than the other. So there was lots of interpretation. Ah, she's sitting slightly close to one. So the next time we met, I sat the other way around. And we had to remember each time to change the position because it matters.
It's the micro, isn't it? It's the detail.
Right. And there's a photograph of John Kerry, Jawad Zarif and myself in Oman for one round of the talks. And Zarif actually said to me, you've got to sit in the middle, you've got to sit with your feet on the ground because that's about respectful, and you've got to show that you're in charge and we are just sitting beside you. And wow. it was about the messages that you send by what you do in a photograph, by where you sit and what you do. Never to be underestimated how important it is and how it's interpreted.
Gosh, every second counts in those rooms, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
We're getting near to the point where I'm going to ask the audience here if they would like to ask you a question. But first, can I ask you something? It's largely a man's world, isn't it? It could be lonely, surely, for the only woman in most of the pictures in the press and to be on your own. How did it feel to have to acclimatise and be really efficient and effective very quickly in that environment?
So the first Foreign Affairs Council that I chaired was 27 countries. It was before Croatia joined the EU. And the way that it's set up is that it's one big circle and just the ministers sit round it and the ambassadors or any officials, not many of them, sit behind them. And so there is me, and I've just got this job. Some of them around the table probably wanted the job. Some of them thought, who's she? Some of them thought, what is this job? Because they had read the Lisbon Treaty, why would you? Yeah. And as I'm sitting there, one of them, who's now the president of Finland, Alex Stubb, who was then foreign minister of Finland, said, Cathy, what's it like to be the only woman in the room? And I looked round and I was. To which I said, it doesn't matter, I'm in charge. I didn't feel much in charge. But I found in the world of foreign policy, although there weren't many women, that it didn't become a thing. It became a thing in the press. It became a thing about what you wore and how you looked and all of that. And of course, as a woman diplomat, you have to think about colour and neckline and skirts and things in a way that men just wear suits with ties and that's it. But in some countries, to wear a particular colour is a sign that you've noticed that it's an important colour in their culture. In other countries, to wear a particular colour may be a sign that you've kind of not understood that those colours are not appreciated or not seen to be appropriate. So you do have to do your homework in a way that I think probably for the ties men do, but not much else. And you find that how you wear your clothes has to allow you to move from presidential palace to refugee camp in the same day. So it affects what you wear, the shoes you wear, all of that. It's a different thing to be a woman in that world. And if you happen, God forbid, to be wearing the same colour as another woman in the room, well, then that's the story. And it is the story. And very briefly and quickly, a story from my life before I went to Brussels when I was in the cabinet. And there's a photograph of 3 cabinet ministers coming out of Downing Street. We happen to be women. We're wearing suits. We're walking down Downing Street. It's a sunny day. Photograph. Headline in the newspaper, heels. We weren't wearing high heels because we're all of a certain age. We were wearing lower heels. But these things kind of get picked up. So you're judged by a different set of criteria and you're written about against a different set of criteria all the time. So you do have to be mindful of that. But in the context of the meetings you're in, I found that being a woman was not an issue. In fact, it was sometimes an advantage. But the best diplomatic teams are men and women together because our life experiences are different. Women manage situations differently. We're not as big as men. We're often, if we're confronted with the men who are being aggressive with each other, we don't join into that. We do it differently. We try and change the mood or we try and change things differently. Another man might find it harder because the other men would treat them differently. it's when you've got both that you can actually set up some really fabulous dynamics and are able to do, I think, the best negotiations.
I'm just going to say, Cathy, it's been an absolute pleasure. And I love the book. You should buy the book or become a diplomat, whatever, whichever's easier. And it's been wonderful to go through so much. But I had to literally, jettison notes all over the place. I could have sat here for another 3 hours asking you questions. So thank you for being such a brilliant sport and telling us about your amazing life and times. And let's see what you do next, because I don't think you're done yet, are you?
Don't know. We'll find out, won't we?
Yeah, we will. Cathy, thank you so much. Thank you. Now, right, we have to get, before we disappear, I'd like to ask the US Consul General to come to the stage. So Jack, if you could come up and introduce yourself so we can also give him a round of applause, everybody. Here's Jack.
Well, I took your advice 24 years ago and I became a diplomat, so. But I do look forward to reading your book as well. As we conclude this evening, I want to extend the sincere gratitude to all who have contributed to this success, especially Susan Murray of the David Hume Institute. Thanks for making this event possible with the EICC. And the Institute does tremendous work here in Scotland to broaden the awareness of public policy debates, to drive change. And I hope that this isn't the last time that we can work together with you as the U.S. Consulate. Your strong work to bring different voices together in the spirit of thoughtful and respectful reflection and debate is commendable, and it certainly has our strong support. So thank you very much for that. Now, my words here say to give a big thanks to Baroness Catherine Ashton, but now I can just call her Cathy.
Yeah.
So thanks very much for that. I have to say, as a diplomat, I enjoyed very much your description of diplomacy. I saw within it a lot of the things that we talk about a lot. I feel very fortunate to be in Scotland so that we didn't have to do any of these difficult negotiations between partners coming at each other. Were you afraid? It's really a wonderful place to be, and especially in a country where you have people coming out like this to have deep thoughts and conversations about diplomacy. It really is a pleasure to be here. My favorite line you said in there, I think, was that the best diplomatic teams are men and women working together. And I think very hard about my own career. I've been very fortunate to work with some fine people that you called colleagues, Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton. My own U.S. ambassador here in the Court of St. James is a woman, and I work together at NATO with female ambassadors. So I think when we do have those together, it does make us stronger. I loved the reference to food and to photographs and to symbols. You'll notice I'm wearing my lapel pin tonight. It all means something. It's very important for all that we do. Tonight was certainly an interesting time to pull back the curtain a little bit and to borrow from the musical Hamilton to hear about what happens in the room where it happened. I must confess that I recently saw Hamilton right down the street here. And I'm reminded by another line in there, and that is, the history has its eyes on you. And it's a reminder that the decisions and the actions, individuals, large and small, have a lasting impact on our history. Despite the significant global challenges that we're facing today, diplomats have a significant role in shaping those events. And I did appreciate the comment on investing more in diplomacy. I'm happy to say that we do have a U.S. budget this week. It was passed. The State Department did take a 6% cut in our budget, while DOD did get a little bit more money. And I think that speaks to some of your comments there, but not being political. This is just bureaucratic. That's all it is. Decisions are made that can have great consequences for our future, and what Cathy talked about at the highest levels of international negotiations just show us how fragile peace, stability, and prosperity can be. But what I hope we'll all be able to take away tonight is this discussion are ways in which nations can work together towards a stable and prosperous world through open communication, finding common ground, and building trust. Diplomacy should always serve as a beacon of hope, even when circumstances appear bleak. And this idea is as important today as perhaps it has ever been. So as I conclude, I want to say thanks again to the David Hume Institute, to the EICC, and of course, a huge thanks to Cathy for sharing her experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. I don't know how to follow that. It was a brilliant note of thanks to finish off what's been a wonderful, insightful evening. What a fascinating discussion. So thank you all for joining us today. It's just left for me to thank everyone. The EICC Live, Marshall and his team have been wonderful in hosting us tonight. Claire, you've done brilliant chairing. And Kathy, thank you for coming to Scotland, because just hearing your stories in the flesh and being in the room where it happens, I have to say, it's the second week in a row, a David Hume Institute event, someone has quoted Hamilton. The words in that musical stun me. If you've not seen it yet, it is the best use of language ever. There's a line that sticks out, which is an economic diuretic. And when I Googled that line to see how it fitted in the passage afterwards, there is a whole PhD thesis on the economic philosophy in Hamilton. So I can recommend that to anyone. So finally, I won't hold you up anymore. The EICC have kindly provided drinks downstairs, so do join us afterwards and carry on the conversation downstairs. So thank you very much, everybody. Woo!